Hello, my name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy in Future. Today I am with my colleague Ridvan Bariur-Costa, and our guest is Mr. Gustav Gressel, based in Berlin. He will be providing us with perspective from Berlin. And he's a senior policy fellow with the Wider Europe program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, a former MOD expert in Austria and expert on strategy and military situation, basically strategic situation in Central and Eastern Europe, Russia's hand, so to speak, in a good flair. And so we will be discussing the strategic landscape in Central and Eastern Europe. So Gustav, hello, welcome to Strategy in Future, and thank you for accepting my invitation to the conversation.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure.
So, how do things look like from Berlin in January 2021 in terms of, the Central and Eastern Europe? I mean, there are, I understand, multiple vectors of attention, and one of those is Russia, another is China, United States, the future of Europe. Let's get started with an overall description. What do you think is the most important trend to observe?
Well, for the time being, Berlin is busy with sorting out vaccinations and dealing with the coronavirus crisis. So that overlays and overlaps everything else. And the sort of strategic foreign policy issues are pushed to the back burner. Nevertheless, there were some strategic decisions made on the last days of the German chairmanship with regard to China, and the discussion on how to deal with Russia is still ongoing. Generally, it's a bit difficult to map a genuine German interest or German policy outline, because the whole political spectrum or the whole political system in Germany is undergoing deep change that will go that will materialize in the coming year. We will have Bundestag elections, Merkel will depart, and we will not only have a chancellor that led the country for more than a decade departing, leaving a huge personal and leadership vacuum in her person and in the party system. We also have a party system that is undergoing deep and profound change. Basically the AfD is now establishing itself as the kind of GDR's post-regime party. The Green Party is replacing the SPD as the commonsensical center-left party, and the SPD's left in a declining limbo where to go. That is still undecided. The FDP and this kind of West German industrial liberalism is also in decline, and especially and more profoundly lost its place in the party system as the key balancing factor between conservative and progressive forces. And so it lost its influence that always was bigger than the 5 to 7% the FDP scored, because it's not this balancing force anymore. And we have an administrative change in the bureaucratic apparatus, but also in terms of political characters, the kind of post-reunification generation. So the successors of Kohl and Genscher, they are fading out. And we have people fading in that were sort of politically socialized during the Merkel era, and these people have a different mindset and a different set of personal contacts, a different set of problems they grew up with and grew up in. So their kind of outlook and solutions for strategic problems is of course different than that of the generation before them, and all of that will boil down sort of one or the other way, and we will see in the next 2 years how it will play out.
And what do you think? What is the overwhelming feeling of yours which trajectory is that going to take, and how will that impact the future of Europe and, you know, this security and strategic landscape?
Well, of course, the biggest decision is on sort of what direction the Conservative Party will steer. There is now a competition for party leadership that will be decided in January. 3 candidates, and probably all of them are just interim candidates. They represent a very different line of thinking and kind of party establishment. If sort of one of them will be selected, and that will automatically seek the camps of the other 2, basically either being in the state of internal rebellion or kind of defecting towards and their votership they attract defecting to other parties. That can have a particularly big impact on the party system. And that sort of in short, we have Armin Laschet, who is a very French-style politician. He's from Western Germany. He's on Russia and the eastern flank. He's very much for a rapprochement, kind of prolonging the Schröder-type engagement style. And on European defense or on NATO defense matters, he's basically seconding Macron's thoughts or French establishment thoughts, which is natural. He speaks French and he's on sort of close to France geographically, and he sort of his intellectual mind revolves more about French discussions than about transatlantic ones. The other candidate is Friedrich Merz, who is at the one hand the most conservative candidate in terms of his sort of political agenda, his societal agenda, and he grew up in the Anglo-Saxon business world, which makes him a candidate that is often sort of thought to be transatlantically minded. Although he's intellectually very flexible and adopts slogans that he thinks seem popular, so it's hard to really pin him down on very tangible views. But of course, it is highly likely that he will rather continue a kind of Schmidt-Kohl, Washington-anchored German foreign policy. And the third one, who is institutionally the weakest within the party, but he's amongst voters one of the very popular candidates, is Norbert Röttgen, a former Minister of Environment, and he's chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who is a very outspoken foreign politician. He is both advocating a more stronger German role, but in this connoted with a very value-based approach. So he's a heavy critic of Nord Stream 2. He's a heavy critic of Germany's lack of addressing NATO eastern flank defenses, and he's very open to these kind of problematics. Said that, he's also the most unlikely candidate because foreign policy issues are not that important and don't produce a big power base in Germany on which you can sort of wrestle in domestic party rallies. But nevertheless, he's popular, and amongst the younger generation, this kind of new self-confident, value-oriented Germans have a votership that is tapped by the Green Party and the Conservatives at the same time. And if sort of the Röttgenship, if I may call them so, will be disregarded in the CDU's leadership contest, you will have a certain amount of young, urban, educated voters that would defect to the Green Party, especially if the Green Party puts more centrist candidates up front, or politicians in the next coalition like Cem Özdemir or Manuel Sarrazin and folks like this. These are the people that can very much attract sort of this kind of voterships and fill the intellectual void that a angered leaving Röttgen would leave within the party. But I think now I'm departing much too deep into German domestic issues.
No, that if I may, Gustav, it is very interesting, because here in Poland we have a debate on the German role. I mean, the German question is again on the top of the European agenda, as it has been on a few occasions, at least in the history of Europe. And the question that I want to ask you is based also on your domestic considerations that you have just so nicely presented. Is how should we understand the internal dynamics in the domestic approach in the domestic politics of Germany, as a vis-a-vis the external situation and challenges that are coming? And I'm meaning here, how should I reconcile, first of all, the AKK, German Ministry of Defense proposition towards Americans from the autumn, yeah, of strategic partnership and being a sort of a junior partner, but independent power, but being a junior partner to the US in the new role that would be against the French proposition of strategic autonomy. And in Poland, we have been watching closely. Well, is that really a message from Berlin to us? Because this is what we would like. What did Angela Merkel think about it, really? And the Office of Chancellery did think about it. And why Germans signed with China then? Was it a contradiction, or is it some sort of a smart, cunning plan to create a level field with the US and China and still have a proposal from AKK? How should we understand all this? Because this is very opaque, very, very vague for outsiders to understand.
Yes.
And we think that Europe is at the crossroads now, okay, here in Warsaw. And we think that the Germans are the biggest horse, and we need to see where the wagon is being pulled. So.
Yes. So first on Merkel. So the problem is, especially in foreign reporting, you have Merkel as a figure in which a lot of ideals of other countries' domestic debates have been put into her character. So if you read the Anglo-Saxon liberal press, like the New York Times or the Washington Post, in the last years, Merkel often was portrayed as the kind of anti-Trump that to some point she was, but to some point she just wasn't. And there are a lot of inconsistencies and illogical steps in her behavior too that depend on very short-term moods and not really long-term considerations as well. Sometimes she really has a good common sense on what is feasible and what not, and sometimes she just listens to wrong advice. And the picture in Berlin is much more muted on all these issues than it sometimes is depicted in a foreign press, either loving or hating her. And the China deal and how to deal with the US is no exception. So generally, Merkel, and one of the problems with her is that she is not really keen on the defense matters. Defense policy is not at the very heart of her. She thinks that the 21st century will be more about economy, technology, etc. That makes the China investment deal the more troublesome than it actually seemed from the outside. Of course, the whole Trump fuss has left a very deep mark on her, and the US, from being one of the prime partners and close relationship with the Obama administration, that was also sort of hard fought. I mean, there were a lot of disagreements with the US in 2011 on how to react to the financial crisis, and basically they came together on this, and then they came together on Russia's Crimea annexation and Ukraine invasion, and that was systematically eroded by Trump, and the China deal was to a certain extent a reaction to that. But again,
if I may, reaction to the sort of hegemonic behavior of the United States as exposed by Donald Trump's economic discussions with China over the heads of Europeans and so on, right? So can we synthesize by saying that Germans wanted to create a level playing field before Biden's team comes in?
they wanted to have a level playing field, and they wanted to have a reassurance. They can still drop the treaty, and they can still go for a different solution. But if things go wrong, they can revert to this plan. Also, note that in the considerations of the German part in the future of the US, it was taken with great relief that Biden won the election, but it was also of concern that the Biden will not have a majority in both houses, and that sort of given the bitter polarization of American domestic politics, he might end up as a lame duck. Basically, he can do things that are within the presidential powers, but if the Senate would have remained Republicans and Republicans would have remained an anti-Biden front, he could not convince, or he could not engage in any sort of policy that would require a treaty, and that is WTO reform, and the WTO needs deep reform, that requires a revival of the transatlantic trade and investment deals, so TTIP, refreshment or successor or whatever, that would certainly have refrained the US from engaging also with the Pacific allies, Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, etc., on trade matters. That was basically changed on January 5th and 6th, so after the trade deal, when the Georgian Senate race produced a very slight but still a Democratic majority, and the storming of the Capitol led to further Republican defections from the Trump line. So you have a kind of weakening and softening of this bitter polarization, with at least some of the Republican more openly siding with Democrats, and hence the whole playing field that Biden as a president in the American political scene can play and can access is much wider than anybody in Berlin thought before January 5th. So in that sense, the trade deal was a tactical miscalculation, because it was basically conducted on assumptions that were outdated.
I understand. So let me again attempt to summarize. So the reason for behind that, the rationale was a Mittellage against German Mittellage, right, between the continent, as epitomized by China, rise of China, and the sort of frictions on strategic flows by Trump and the United States, and Germany wanted just to kick the can down the road and have the open access to everything, and it was a insurance policy.
Yes,
to have this continental pact. But you know that the United States doesn't like continental pacts against, its maritime hegemony in terms of the trade. In the past, the German, flirting with that ended up very badly for Germany. Westbindung was the opposition of that. Is there any debate about the caution, or maybe this is a reasonable approach because there is a feeling in Germany that the United States is gone, it's in major decline, and it will not have a leverage to change the state of affairs?
Well, both are there. You have the inner German identity debate that basically kicked into gears after sort of the double shock of 2014 and 2015. But it's basically a debate that is especially rampant in east of Germany, because East Germany did not have the whole identity experience that the West could make through, from starting from denazification to the 68 challenge of how denazification was done, the kind of multiple lingering of German identity, European integration from the standard, NATO, being a part of NATO, etc. All that was not part of the East Germans' identity debate. Here in East Germany, the East German apparatus basically continued a lot of the former regime's propaganda lines and ideological ways of thinking and at the same time proclaiming to be true anti-fascist, and suppressed any kind of thinking about national identity continuity with history, because there were sort of now the new history, the new man, the new society, and the new order under the banner of socialism that they were said to be forming, and it all basically blew up then in 1998, and the East Germans asked themselves, so who are we? And after it's the same as in many other former communist countries. After 25 years of being busy to catching up to wealth and buying Mercedes cars, once you sit in your Mercedes cars and have your house, you start to ponder on bigger issues like, who am I? What is my history? What is my destiny? What is sort of the my understanding of justice and order and rule of law and blah blah blah, etc. And all that boils up, but it's still,
Gustav, so what is Germany?
Predominantly East German.
Mm-hmm. So what is Germany then?
What is Germany then?
Now, in this Germany, U.S.-China, in this U.S.-China competition, great power competition across Eurasia, what is Germany?
No, Germany is still part of the West. Germany is still a major European nation within the European Union and within the Western community of democratic states and rule of law abiding open market societies. Although this is challenged in some wings in Saxonia and Thüringen, and Andreas Kalbitz will have a different opinion that the mainstream German and the overwhelmingly majority of the Germans perceive it the same way. By language, Germany is closer bound to the Anglo-Saxon realm than many other European countries. English is so easy to learn if you start with German. The amount of student exchange, pupil exchange to England and the United States is still high. The US is the most popular state for especially retirees. So German pensioners, if they can afford to live abroad, they predominantly choose Florida. So there is a high level of trans-societal interaction that always was an asset, but now is also at risk, because the problem is that two sort of big Anglo-Saxon anchors of this Westernness, and the relation to these two powers always defined the German way of Westernness since Konrad Adenauer made this choice, and nobody dared to revoke it. They are in deep identity crisis themselves, the United Kingdom, and the whole Brexit saga, and of course the deepening polarization that ended up in Trump, but it didn't start with Trump. Trump is a product of this bipartisan polarization and American identity crisis, and that is radiating into Germany, and Germany is confused and insecure where this Anglo-Saxon world that was their anchor will head towards. If you look, for example, into German newspapers, nowadays it's almost exclusively about the situation in Washington and a bit of Brexit. Other foreign news have by and large disappeared. We had on Monday, we had a conference on the South Caucasus and Nagorno-Karabakh. It didn't, it's the capital. So this is the mindset of the Germans. And I think it will improve once Britain and US re-emerge more stable and stronger from this crisis.
So what is your personal opinion, Gustav? Where are we as a world now, and structurally? So what will happen to Germany, Europe, United States, China? One step. I think that the foundation stones on which we built the European project 30 years ago, and it expanded to embrace Poland and other countries, and that Russia was out of the balancing game in Europe because it lost the Cold War, and that China would accept American-led system of liberal world order, and the Germans that prospered extensively by the system, from the system, all those foundation stones are gone. And probably tell me, you think they will come back, or just what's
no, the 90s will not come back. The role of the United States as a leader of the free world, I think, will remain, but it will be a different free world, and it will be a different role of leadership that they have to perform, which is for the Germans the most difficult thing to adapt, because it demands much more for them to do themselves and be much more precise and less inconsistent as they have been in the past. But we are entering a phase where the preeminence of the United States as global power and the whole sort of Western European / Anglo-Saxon way of doing politics and perceiving an order to all societal spheres, stemming from states' constitutions down to how we trade goods and services and how we regulate or not regulate the internet, is challenged by an authoritarian China. And there are other revisionist powers that bandwagon on sort of the Chinese train that wants the Chinese wreck the American hegemony, that they can carve out a sphere of influence or carve out some extra rights for them as well. And these are states like Russia, but also like Turkey, down to very small revisionist states like Hungary. And basically, the overall situation will be decided by how the US prevails in face of the Chinese challenge. But our continental situation will be decided on how can we deter the minor revisionists. Now, of course, most predominantly Russia, but as well as others in our vicinity, not to use any opportunity to carve out their sphere of influence on our expense, and at the same time provide as much support to the Americans as we can afford to give. We might not be able to give a lot, because Russia will be a cake that is pretty hard to chew for ourselves. But if we can, we should. That I sort of in some parts of Europe, this has this thought has come up earlier. I think the French discussion on China is much more advanced, even if France is troublesome on other fronts and issues. But
don't you think that French already think that America lost and there is no return to the situation that the Americans could prevail?
No, the French way of thinking that sort of we are the leader of Europe. Europe is ours, and that EU means harnessing Europe for French interest. That is older than the current crisis. This is as old as France. This is older than the Fifth Republic. You know, this is the French music that has been played in post-World War II Europe all the time. The iterations change. Nevertheless, the French. And if you look at the early days of Trump presidency, because Trump and Macron have a lot of characteral similarities, when it looked that they would be more of a tandem than opponents, the French would be, and they were a good ally to the US if the US sort of refrains from being a European power that also serves as a counterbalancer to the French, which the Americans from time to time have been, and which of course angers Paris. But apart from that, they're not so far apart. Now the problem on the current times is, you know, with two alpha males like Trump and Macron, sort of the honeymoon didn't last long. But that's a different story.
Gustav, by the way, you mentioned Hungary, let's say, small revisionist, but at the same time, let's say, if we think about the future of Europe, where is Poland in this new structure, geopolitical structure of Europe?
That's hard to say because you're basically undergoing the same identity or a similar identity crisis that evolves into deep political polarization, and this has led to an incapacitation of playing a major role at the European field, which is sad. And it's dearly missed, I can tell you from Berlin. But this is the way things are. And again, it depends on how this identity question is decided and how you decide to have a role for yourself in the European system. I don't see big external influences on this debate. It's domestic.
And how do you define? Let our listeners understand how you see from Berlin this identity crisis in Poland. What are the divide lines?
Well, the divide lines are, of course, in party politics between PiS and PO by and large, and then you have in the progressive camp the old SLD and all succession parties, and in the conservative camp also the cookies, Confederacja, and whatever. In not saying that they're the same. They're definitely not, but in terms of reinterpreting Poland's history, in terms of reinterpreting Poland's identity, what makes a Pole, what defines Polishness, what are the core values the country stands for, what are the core values that distinguish you from others, and how distinguishable are you, and how to order your society, which principles and division of labor in the state's institutions functioning you give. You have fundamental differences, and they transpire into the crisis about the constitutional court, that transpire into issues and how to deal with apportions. They transpire into issues of wartime reparations with regard to Germany. I would to make it very primitive, it looks like there is one camp that wants to reenact the Polish Second Republic, ignoring that the Polish Second Republic had a very different geopolitical environment and lived in a very different time, both in terms of domestic politics and the trendiness of domestic politics, as well as, of course, in how Europe and the world was structured. And that basically leaning onto the Second Republic as an example is in the German view is a dead end, because it doesn't produce any tangible examples or strategies for contemporary Poland. But it's the course that seems to be the one of the new government that defines Poland's European policy, as well as how it perceives the role of the state in domestic politics, how it perceives the role of the state as managing authority on various international levels. Well, let's see.
And the second camp is
and the second camp understands Poland as trying to be Europe's South Korea, making economic modernization the first and foremost priority, delinearize, put issues of domestic wealth, social equality, and also, of course, identity politics below the aim of technological and economic modernization, which I think is a bit fallen out of time, but this is rather the classical 80s approach, but it would try to be a seek an amplifying base for your own interests in both the transatlantic and the wider European theater instead of consolidating a consensus in the society, which probably was the recipe for their domestic political dooms, because they had no coherent domestic narrative. They had a very coherent European narrative on the European stage, what Poland is and wants to have. This is why the PO is very popular in Berlin and in other capitals, but they didn't have a very coherent domestic one, which is why they're out of power.
But
And
just
Yes,
a short
Ridwan,
one.
sure.
If, for instance, we speak about like a domestic agenda of PO, but what about the, like, not global but European agenda? From your point of view, how they see the future of Europe? Let's say oppositional parties in Poland.
Well, of course, they're much more positive about the framework of the EU as such. Here, the sort of Poland tried to, or the previous government tried to repeat Germany's and Italy's role in Europe after 1945, trying to not only use the sort of integration into Europe in the economic sphere as a source of domestic and technological modernization, but also as a sort of use this modernization and the rebuilding of the economy as a form of national defense, in terms of sort of harmonizing your role within NATO and the EU to maximize your net gain in security, and don't play it out against each other. The current government seems to be much more focused on the hard security field, but not trying to do the technological and economic modernization as sort of from domestic sources, with domestic state-owned industries and with sort of domestic research institutes, with selective bilateral partnerships with the US, the UK, some selective European countries, but not entrust this into a wider European market approach. That's what, at least as it looks from Berlin, is the difference.
And what is the optimal scenario for Germany then, with respect to Poland?
Well, this is also then a question of what kind of Germany you want, but the sort of the traditional westbound Germany saw the whole process after 1989 as a huge chance for making good what it has done bad on Europe after 1918. The fate of Poland was a direct result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and the reintegration of Eastern Europe as a whole was the ultimate reconciliation and the ultimate sort of Wiedergutmachung is the German expression, but I don't know how to say that in English. For German
reconciliation
policy.
sort of, yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yes, but sort of a more reconciliation in English is more on a political, spiritual thing, but on a materialized thing, sort of to provide these states and peoples with the same chances and opportunities for economic and societal development that was deprived, that they were deprived from by being either a German or a Soviet slave. And hence, of course, Poland, from the German identity and from the German domestic political sphere, had a huge weight by being Poland in itself, because it was sort of the Second World War started on 1st of September with the attack on Poland. It was the first victim. The Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia at the time, was the true first, but then it was Poland, and a wider German-Polish reconciliation, and given sort of also the role of Poland in the transatlantic link could from the German side be both cementing the union as the project of reconciliation in Europe and linking the union to the wider transatlantic world and the wider Western world as such. Unfortunately, on an emotional level, this is lost because Germany is the kind of key country when it comes to bashing decadent Western Europeans in the Polish newspapers, and Poland is sort of the key reference point in lining out democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe. Which I mean, it's hard to say why it is that way, given that Hungary is much worse on the scale, and that situation in Bulgaria and Romania is also not very happy. But as the expectations into Poland were much higher than the expectations towards Hungary, and you have the closeness, your direct neighbors, there are a lot of trans-societal contexts, there are lots of mixed marriages, sort of the large parts of groups of Germans living in Poland and Polish living in Germany. It is a much more grave disappointment what happens and what is talked to in Poland about Germany than what sort of Orban and his media says, which is basically ignored in the German debate.
Maybe Poland is simply much more important for the prosperity of Germany than Hungary is. And do you think that, is there any debate, do you think that Germany has its Mitteleuropa project in reality, in place?
I don't think so. So the then Mitteleuropa project that was crafted during the First World War,
and by that I because put the emotions aside, I mean, and sort of bad connotations. I'm talking about supply chains, value chains, division of value and labor, and sort of everything gravitates towards the German economic power horse, and this was always the objective of Germany, is it? Or it happens automatically because of productivity. So do Germans think that they have it in place, and that's why? And it doesn't have to be a bad thing, just for you to know. Just I mean, don't be concerned that you're talking to Poles, that we are so emotionally attached to the past. It might be good because the center of gravity is moving eastwards, and France is losing, Germany is winning, and Eastern Europe is winning too.
The problem here emotionally for an Austrian going to Germany is that the myth of sort of Germany being more advanced and better and technically superior is sometimes it's quite busted. I mean, I don't want to go too deep into private life, but if it starts from how houses are built here and there. I sometimes have difficulty glorifying Germany as the sort of unique technologically super country that some to aspire to Germany. But okay, let's keep this aside. Yes, of course, the value chains are important, and in terms of global strategic decoupling, that will, despite of the sort of December deal with China, will happen with Europe as well. Supply chain control is increasingly important for the French and the British, and the Germans are slowly waking up to the topics. Of course, all these issues will be beneficial to closer neighborship relations, and Poland will have a major role. But of course, so do other European countries across the Baltic Sea, the Baltic countries, Sweden especially, in post-Brexit Europe's Sweden's weight has grown. The Netherlands and on a very long run, I would also count Ukraine in, because of sort of the structure of the education system, the skilled labor force, and of course the price difference. So you have this kind of Central European conglomerate that sort of stretches from Ukraine to the manufacturing side and down up to the Netherlands. But the the way how to manage this is important. And here, actually, you quickly see that once the Germans sort of revert to their topic of preeminence, and sort of, we tell you how things are done and we do things unilaterally and you have to wake up to reality later, this faces extraordinary backlashes. I think Nord Stream 2 is the perfect example of it. The amount of effort the Germans had to put into pushing this through in Europe against the resistance from pretty much everybody except their small blocking minority that could keep the Commission at bay is a prime example. And it's just the pipeline. Imagine the Germans would try to repeat this nonsense on a wider scale. It wouldn't happen. And this is why the rule of the thumb for all of this, that is kind of Germany as a political consensus builder from within Europe, will prevail, which is Germany's traditional role, starting from Adenauer. Helmut Kohl was probably the most elaborate consensus builder the Germans had, but most of the time Merkel also stuck to the German consensus building model. She had very few unilateral impulses. One is the China deal, and there were very few others. But on a large scale, the Germans kept to this model, because otherwise you just breed resistance. It will bring you nowhere. And the power structure isn't there to be a big unilateralist pole. Germany is no nuclear power. Germany is no P5 member. The share of Germany in the world economy compared to what it was in 1914 or 1913 is much smaller. The amount of technological innovations is still impressive what the Germans can pull, but they can only pull this as a sort of a European network, and being look at the vaccines, and being integrated in the wider transatlantic sphere for the sake of finances. So the kind of unilateral strength on which much of the Mitteleuropa thoughts were based on, they aren't there anymore. This is gone. What still stays is sort of the time of confusion. In 1915, sort of Mitteleuropa emerged after the first big losses of the Tsarist army, when the Germans realized that there would be a post-Tsarist space they need to bring order to, and given the state and the domestic organization of their key ally, the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, a kind of German empire wouldn't do, because this would disintegrate Austria, and so they have to find some kind of subsidized federal loose alliance that allows for multiple shifts to preserve the Austrians on the one hand, secure German leadership on the other hand, and provide a lot of space for in-betweens to play one state against the other that emerges from there. Well, it all went nowhere, because Germany at the final stages then lost World War I. But of course now the situation in terms of how the economy, how international relations, how the current order is structured, a repetition of this is pretty infeasible. And also in terms of bureaucratic tradition, the kind of Bonn Republic way of dealing with things is so deep immersed in the German bureaucratic system that I don't think we will have major departures from it. We have upkicks against it, especially in East Germany that never was part of this system. But at the end of the day, it still looks like the system will prevail in one or the other form. If not, the amount of domestic crisis for Germany, how to realign its own internal governance system, will also be profound. one shouldn't underestimate that kind of in German federalism, in the balance between federal states and the central states. The EU level was always in, and it was there almost from the beginning of this round of German statehood. This kind of academic discussions on what different models of state order and European order you would want to have, they are practically undoable for such strong immersed and traditionalist systems that just have evolved over 70 years of peacetime, like Germany.
Ridvan?
Yes, you mentioned Northern Stream, so it would be really interesting your perspectives regarding why Germany still was so consistent and keep this project. US pushed, many countries pushed, everyone pushed, give up this project, but Germany continued. Do you have explanations? Yes.
Yeah. So Nord Stream, it looks consistent from the outside. It was also a very strong domestic debate and push between different agencies inside Germany. One thing is that it clearly marks the foreign policy community in Germany pretty much unisono rejected it and said it was nonsense. The economic community pushed very hard for it. And you have the prime pushers for it, of course, were the key energy companies who basically feared that with German departure from coal and nuclear power at the same time, they might face crunches in energy supply in the future. And because of the high taxation of energy that will, with the CO2 tax, also increase, they will lose competitiveness on a European scale. Nord Stream 2 provided them with cheap gas, and Nord Stream 2 provided it, especially in the initial phase of the pipeline, the opportunity to re-export the gas to Southeastern Europe, where you have the highest market prices for natural gas. So they would make considerable gains on re-exporting this gas also to the Netherlands, where domestic production is fading, and at a later stage to the United Kingdom and France, where the North Sea gas is fading out. And this re-export margin would keep them in a competitive margin, despite having to shoulder the burden of reshifting their production. This was the rationale they consistently brought to the Chancellery. And on the Chancellery's table, you had the foreign policy heads that said, well, look, this uses a loophole in European regulations, so it will bring up all the others, like Bulgaria, Italy, that had pipeline projects that were killed by the EU Commission. Against up, it's a bad mark if you want to tell the Italians that, a 3% deficit is 3% deficit because pacta sunt servanda, and you have to keep European law, etc. And it will have complications with Eastern Europe, with the Americans, and so on. They at times underestimated the complications it will have, and it will bring them. They consistently did so, and in consistent battles between foreign policy-minded people and domestic economy won. Also, these were parts of internal political decisions. When Nord Stream 2 came up in September 2015, it was basically the refugee crisis was ongoing, and German industry backed Merkel in her decision to temporarily suspend the Dublin II mechanism. So she couldn't confront the industry when they were backing her on a controversial decision inside. There were a lot of, tactical temporary shifts that at the end produced this result. The problem for Germany on the bigger scale is now they have a huge foreign policy problem that will only increase with the new Biden presidency, because they have a president that has much more legitimacy than in asking for German contributions and an offset than Trump. And by this offset, Biden will tell basically the next chancellor, look, we are supplying weapons to Ukraine. We are the biggest contributor to maneuvers on the eastern flank. We are the key intelligence provider on Russian military movement, subversion, Russian intelligence to all partner countries inside NATO or outside NATO. If we buy more Russian oil due to sanctions on Venezuela, we have an offset in place that sort of increased cash flow into Moscow. And the security dimension that has is counterbalanced by 6th Cavalry, etc., in Europe. What's your offset, guys? You're not investing much in defense, and you're having a pipeline, and you're not supporting the Ukraine, and your intelligence on the Russians is weak. What's your offer, guys? Which is the much more tricky question for Germany to answer than Trump trying to use Nord Stream 2 as just a way to bully Germany in the wake of a trade war. Because that basically made the Germans trench in because they thought that it was tactical and it was just a prelude to a wider trade war, and they can't give in because you don't give in trade wars, at least not at the beginning. So it was for them much easier to defend this kind of stuff against the Trump administration than against the Biden administration, and the thing will become much more tricky in the future. The problem is it's basically built, so they can't scrap the project that easy, now that they see that they shouldn't have done it. So they have made a huge quagmire for themselves that they will find problems extracting them.
But you're saying shouldn't, but they're continuing still, despite political considerations.
Now the problem is if the German government now holds the pipeline, this was considered briefly after the Navalny poisoning, and the consensus or nearby consensus opinions of the government's lawyers were, then they will sue you for compensation, and you will have to pay the 90% built by pipeline. So the federal government, the regional governments have different ways, but the federal government basically decided to not formally stop it, but not do anything against sanctions. There was this notorious, strange Nord Stream 2 lobby foundation that was formed by the regional government of Schleswig-Holstein. There originally were ideas floating around in Germany that one can set up such a foundation under public law in Germany to kind of finance the completion of Nord Stream 2 as sort of an instrument of the German government and not on private enterprises, because the problem with sanctions is they can build the pipeline, but to ensure it and to operate it, they will not find the capital, not only to build, but especially to ensure the pipeline. So, and this basically with the Navalny poisoning, this kind of backing for the pipeline from the federal government has been scrapped, and now sort of one of the regional governments in East Germany tries to replicate this stuff, and we'll see what the outcome is. I'm still skeptical that they will actually be able to rise and hide the money and evade American sanctions. Probably they will have a very bad awakening in a couple of months.
We will have to navigate towards the end slowly, although not yet. I have two very simple or straight questions, and then, of course, I would like to ask you whether you will have any questions to us. Maybe you want to know our opinions about things, so that's a two-way street during this interview and conversation. I always find it interesting if people are really wondering what the other side thinks. But I have two straight questions first. Do you think that America will prevail over China in this competition, or they will not?
I hope, pray, and beg that they will.
Yeah, but
we have.
But first, is that not good strategy, and hope so.
I know. The thing is, I think they will prevail if they can avoid a sort of civil war scenario within the American society. Mm-hmm. If they stay united, they will prevail it will hard to prevail, but they will, because at the end, I still think the innovative power of a free society is higher than state-centric management, despite of digital computing tools, especially in a war. Wars are always messy and shitty, and you can't calculate wars. And here especially with allies, the amounted mass of innovative and creative thinking and the internal checks and balances to nonsense that the free world as a whole, which the United States lead, put on the table, is big enough to prevail. However, if they sink in another civil war, if they give up on their leadership, if the rest, because we will all be defeated, divided. The Japanese will not prevail unilaterally against the Chinese, nor will the South Koreans, nor will Taiwan hold out. And I don't think that we will put up a very effective show without the Americans against the Russians. But together, this is feasible.
And the second straight question that actually expands your answer a little bit. So do you think that in the predictable future, both Poland and Germany will feel the force that will be negotiating the space with Russians, because the transatlantic world will be gone, and we will need to take the situation into our hands, and the Germans will need to change to do it, and Poles will join, and it will be the center of Europe?
No, I think if we are divided and separated from the United States, the unilateralist instincts in each of the countries will prevail. We have basically seen the Europeans, not only the Germans on Nord Stream 2, but you could say, including Poland, depending on which decision you pull, each European country has fundamentally failed the European idea over the last 4 years at some point in some time, at some point of crisis. So without American leadership, we will go nowhere. However, this leadership will be much softer and much more indirect, and will demand much more contribution and self-reliance and cleverness from our side than at any stage during the Cold War or the post-Cold War world. And that will be challenging enough, both for the Germans and for the Poles. It will be challenging for both of us to put our domestic instincts on the back burner for the sake of prevailing in this. So it will not be boring.
I share this opinion, and I think that this is what AKK proposition was all about. This is how I read it. So you should know that it was properly read in Warsaw, although probably German didn't care too much at that point of the time about it. But in our opinion, it was also completely against Macron's vision of strategic autonomy, which means that Germany will need Poland to balance the French vision of that.
The problem is sort of the Brexit hole. We haven't figured out how to balance each other in Europe after the departure of the Brexit. But the interesting thing is, if you look into the countries and governments that seconded AKK's comments, you will find the Spanish Prime Minister who came out openly in support, and you also have some Italian voices, especially after their hard-won lecture on how to deal with China, that specifically stressed AKK's vision. So this will come back to Macron, who is sort of, as I said earlier, he's not too far away from Trump in his political instincts. That sort of the French push to try to superimpose the French vision, because strategic autonomy, I mean, the principle of the term is okay, but the French meant that strategic means French strategy, and France's strategic aims to be fulfilled, and autonomy meant to have autonomy on French terms and with French command, and that basically was unacceptable to a much wider range of European states, short of their problems with Russia.
Gustav, if I may share my opinion about this French proposition with you, France doesn't have any leverage in Central and Eastern Europe. Macron could travel around the region and talk about discussions with Russia and creating a sort of a French vision of Europe only because Poland exercised strategic restraint over the last 30 years in our Eastern policy, in our buffer zones in the East. We did it for the sake of purpose of cohesion of the West as a collective geopolitical unit. If we see the breakup of it, and we saw it last year, 2020, and if we keep hearing about strategic autonomy run by French who want to invite the Russians to play the balancing game against Turkey, and maybe another time against United States or against Poland, we will break the French leverage in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's easily doable, very easily doable. We will wait for the occasions and we will show that they cannot run an agency here. We didn't do it for the sake of cohesion of the West, and because we wanted to be in the EU, and so on and so forth. And I think that France thinks that Europe ends on Rhine River, maybe Elbe, but it's not the case. It's not the case. And this is exactly the counterbalancing that you're afraid of. This is why Germany is in the middle. Germany is the question for Europe, because Germany can really play the factor that can sort of take Europe into the future in a way. The past emotions of the past to be pushed aside,
but then, may I put a question to you? What would be the result of the breakup?
Which breakup?
If Poland said, okay, it's sort of we have enough of French unilateralism. We're leaving the shop.
The French will need to follow because they will not have an option. They will simply become. They will need to follow what the new majority of Europe will want. They will now have option. The British can think that out of Europe they can have the future, which is doubtful too. But France, what future does France have without Europe? So it's simply that they will need to come to terms with the fact.
Yes, I mean it's always a joy to bash the French. Sorry, my microphone is falling down. Especially what we have witnessed through with Macron to cite one major German lawmaker who one of the ruling parties in Germany in a discussion about the French reach out to Russia. I'm quoting literally, on a matter of such huge strategic magnitude, you either speak with one European voice or you shut up. So the Moscow reach out, but also his language on NATO, have caused the French so much more trouble than good. The problem is in Europe, there are reasonable elements within the French political establishment, and the question to us is how to amplify these elements over the Napoleonic instincts of French unilateralism, because at the end, also Europe depends to a certain extent really on the French, and on some things I actually, for example, the French have been drumbeating the issue of increased European capacities all the time in defense, and I fully second that. Without tanks and guns and airplanes, nobody's deterred. Power comes from powerful means. Without military, without intelligence, without police, you can make up plans and speeches, whatever you want. You will reach nothing, especially with powers like Russia. as much as that the Macron's rhetoric is not helping, I don't see much value of sort of trying to come up in a counter-Macronish way to kind of bash the French for the sake of bashing the French to show them who they are. We need to be cleverer than Macron and find our way into the French debate, which is of course enormously difficult because it's a language island that is very proud of being a language island, and it's very closed cycles of strategic and administrative elites.
But Gustav, it's very simple in a way. Of course, that according to AKK, the Germans will need to boost expenditure on the power projection military, and she is proposing it, and it's understandable. Poland is ready. French are saying that they want to run the show because they have some sort of, power projection, but they cannot project power to our part, to my part of the world. They are nobody here. As simple as that.
Yeah.
And their nuclear forces on the escalation ladder are not designed to counter Russia on one-on-one. They were designed to pull the Americans into the war in Europe, but not to confront Russia in a strategic autonomy fashion. So the French don't have currency to operate as a great power and consolidate.
Well, if the trend that sort of the French military forces, when they started to re-enter the military structure of NATO, there was a big debate about what about France's nuclear forces and the state sort of a unilateral assets. But there were times when sort of when there were discussions of having joint nuclear maneuvers. They never materialized, unfortunately, but inserting especially what the French call pre-strategic nuclear weapons, these are good tools for nuclear signaling and communications. If the French would be willing to insert their means that are not negligible, but if they were willing to insert their means into the wider European security agenda and the NATO agenda, like this common sort of joint nuclear maneuvers, that would be a good amplifier, and it would be welcome. And at the end, even if they have small nuclear forces, they have nuclear forces. If you want to deter Russia, and it's not without the Americans, but if you can supplement the Americans, good. If you make joint nuclear war plans with the Americans, better. So I, the problem is that with the current president, all this is not possible, and with the most likely immediate contender of this president, is a certain madam, it's also not possible. So the pondering is how what shift does the French political spectrum need to undergo to have a more sustainable place in Europe, instead of this kind of up and down, being part and being not part, and unilateral instincts destroying the work that others have prepared. But I'm not a specialist on France domestic issues. It's a thing that others need to clear out. But I don't think we should sort of throw away or the idea of having France being a wider part of it. It's just for the time being a pain in the backside.
My judgment from what you're saying is, or implying, but also saying openly, is that you are very much preoccupied with the structural forces within Europe that sort of bar Europe from being a cohesive unit and deliver security and prosperity in those turbulent times that are coming. Yes, am I reading properly what you're saying?
Yes, yes.
And you know that it has been the problem since the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yes, but despite of all these problems, the Europe we have built is quite impressive, and a lot of others envy us for that. So I mean, my family, they were all professional officers before, sort of until November 11th, 1918, and they were from the military border. This is sort of the southern part of Austria. That was the nobility there had privileged rights and tax autonomy, etc. But they had to be basically military commanders all the time, and they had a military function all the time, and they had all the time Turkish incursions into their territory. So it was a kind of war fighting zone, buffer zone. So we've done that for 400 years and prevailed. So, you know, who are the Russians to disturb up? Stupid Pavlov state that came up in the last 200 years, 300 years.
That's true, Gustav. What a beautiful sort of conclusion of our conversation. Ridvan, yes, go ahead.
Yes, but I just think that it would be fair to let Gustav present his understanding of European strategic sovereignty, because within last year, maybe 3 times he dedicated his articles regarding this term. So it is perfectly fitting to our discussion. How you do understand in a short way, so but in order to grasp the idea.
Okay. Now, with Nico Popescu, I wrote some papers about strategic autonomy. We had invited you in ECFR a project about strategic autonomy and what it would mean, and I wrote 2 pieces with Nico. The one was more academic, like where is the delta in European capabilities? Sort of before you speak of strategic autonomy, what would it need in terms of capabilities in the intelligence and IT sector to really live up to that phrase, which is, you know, the delta is huge. So the second paper was if we define a strategic sovereignty, it was not autonomy, it was sovereignty, that you can conceive policies and execute policies in a way that they are harnessed against obfuscation from another party. And you apply this thought to the Eastern neighborhood, where, of course, the obfuscator is Russia. What would it need? So how much more robust your foreign policy relations would have to be if you would set the benchmark for strategic sovereignty, the benchmark that the French are driving for Africa, for North Africa, for the Middle East, towards the Eastern neighborhood. I mean, the thing is, we had a summit in I think end of December also, where the Europeans, again under French leadership, basically cleared up a certain amount of points, or it was beginning of January, how the EU should engage in security partnerships with certain African states, building their security sector, their intelligence sector, reforming their armed forces so that they are up to the task of fighting these long-term insurgencies against predominantly Islamist terrorist groups. And it's in principle, these partnerships with Africa is a good idea. It needs to be done. But you know, if Niger is a partner on security, Ukraine is as well. Georgia is as well. We debated whether we can supply anti-tank guided weapons to Ukraine over years, and finally the Americans did. At the same time, the Europeans gave anti-tank guided weapons to the Kurds fighting the Islamic States. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that to the Kurds. I think the Kurds did a tremendously good job in fighting the Islamic State, and I fully support equipping them with anti-tank guided missiles. It was justified and strategically wise and good. But if you then look at the arguments that were brought up against delivering the same weapon system to Ukraine, they said, well, Ukrainians' procurement system is unreformed and unreliable. Yeah, agree. You risk losing these weapons in combat, and they might be picked up by the Russians. Okay. The Ukrainian armed forces are tactically not at the best state of military organization, so they need a lot of training beforehand so they can use it. Okay, fine. So how about the Kurdish Peshmerga? Is their logistics system on NATO standards so they can receive it? Are there no Russian troops in Syria that could pick up such a weapon? And how tactically perfect are they compared to NATO armed forces to use them? So
yeah, Gustav,
this is getting ridiculous. You know, you can.
It's all, of course, it's all about interests and great power interests, and the stability of the international system with great powers are actually, you know, it's all about preventing war between great powers. Yeah, at the end of the day.
In Syria, you had officially US delivered Tau anti-tank guided missiles, and they were officially delivered. The US cleared, I mean, they were delivered via Saudi Arabia, but you had an official State Department and DoD clearance for them because re-export needs clearance with Washington. Decision to supply them to the Free Syrian Army. And they engaged in officially deployed, official Russian troops, not little green man, but sort of by law and decree deployed Russian troops and killed them at helicopters in Syria. And we didn't slide into World War III. We have been fighting proxy wars with the Soviet Union for so long time. And there were even German intelligence people immersed in Taliban or Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan. I mean, and they didn't behave like sheeps and kindergarten teachers there. You know, they had to fight to show up to the locals that they were doing business seriously. The prudence we have put on ourselves, the idea that any assertive step in Eastern Europe would anger the Russians, to my point of view, is exactly the wrong recipe. The Russians don't have to like other countries, but they respect the strong ones. And we shouldn't aim at being liked in the Kremlin, because basically in their heart, the Russians don't know how to like other people. They know how to respect other people, not to like.
Yes,
Gustav. And if we want to be respected, we have to be much more assertive and show balls.
And in that vein, the events of August and September 2020 were transformational in Poland. It was a pivotal moment because of Belarus. And we had exercised strategic restraint in the East, in our eastern buffer zones, for the last 30 years, because we thought that we entered the cohesive unit of the West, acting in concerted way and expanding and promoting values and interests, and of course, capital penetration and so on and so forth. But the West was so powerful that it was in automated mode. So we didn't, use the traditional method of influence, reconnaissance and stuff, and military power projection. But in events in Belarus, when we saw that the West is toothless, it is all about correlation of power and forces. The Russians were determined to go to war over Belarus. They had capabilities to go to war. Germany, France, and other Western countries didn't have appetite for war, and they didn't have capacity to go to war. So things will change now, because we think that within the new generation warfare concept, Russia is perfectly aligning political goals with the military gray zone, and not only gray zone capabilities. And the threshold to take on the Russians is not high enough. I mean, it's not too high for Poland. And we don't believe anymore in the West balancing Russia in that respect, because we see it's toothless, doesn't have military power. While we have GDP and we are strong enough to really face it, like Turkey does. So, and successfully, by the way. So if things don't change quickly within Europe, and if Biden administration doesn't come up with a very, strategically reasoned argument how they are going to win over China and Russia, you were right by saying that everybody will go opportunistic for security reasons. Yeah, and things have changed here over the last couple of months because of Belarusian thing. Belarus for Poland is a pivotal place. It's our security buffer. You remember Barbarossa. You remember Bagration, Army Gruppe Mitte. What happened within 4 weeks from the Smolensk Gate to the Vistula River? It's a highway, military highway. So this is a security threat, and things, as you're right, things are changing very fast in the security environment around Europe.
Yeah, the problem is sort of, just to get it right, that our stakes in Belarus were our ability to act on the ground there are enormously limited. Belarus, and also in sort of in official Russian doctrines and under the Union state, Belarus is a matter of nuclear escalation very quickly. So if there is one good argument on why the Americans need to be in Europe and need to continue to be in Europe, then Belarus is the one. It's even bigger than Ukraine because of the sort of the Union state and the stakes the Russians have put up on this. If you look into the Russian maneuvers rehearsing scenarios, and if you compare this to the maneuvers that have been invoked in the last couple of months, and that we are looking into Zapad 21, which I don't think will be downscaled for the sake of coronavirus. This is basically the most dangerous place in the whole front, and yeah. So, and it's not only for Poland, for the Ukrainians as well. You get a huge increase in the length of the front that they have to cover, and basically they're then in a similar impossible to defend situation like the Georgians.
Sure.
And it's not a comfortable place to be and to make reforms in an indefensible place against a nuclear powered neighbor, unless you're part of an alliance.
True. True.
But that's a different discussion, I think, beyond this podcast.
That's true. Although very interesting, and maybe that's a sort of a vague promise that we will repeat this conversation about the real eastern flank, eastern front issues. Actually, it's more than of a front than on the flank, from the Black Sea at least to the Gulf of Riga or Gulf of Finland. So this is how we see it in Warsaw. Within the correlation of forces, conventional forces, post-INF regime of missile warfare. So we're back to history, Gustav, as you see. Also in Europe, how things changed over the last 15 years, haven't they?
Well, actually, if you look into how each of the parties behaved during the disintegration of Yugoslavia, Serbia supporting clandestinely Bosnian Serbs and the Russians in the backing, how the flow of volunteers and propaganda went. We all shouldn't have been surprised by this. We all shouldn't have been surprised. And if you look into old transcripts, some of them, I think, the Austrian MOD is purging their homepage of all text, but there are some old transcripts of meetings with Russian interlocutors in Moscow after the Kosovo war from 1999. What the Russians told there, if you read it, you would have known what would come. The problem is, especially in Western Europe, people didn't read and ignored and didn't listen to what was said in Moscow. And then I was surprised by what came out of it. Yeah.
Maybe it's really good moment just to put an end to our conversation. Our guest was Gustav Gressel. Thank you very much, Gustav, for this really great conversation. Ridvan Bariur-Costa and Jacek Bartosiak, Strategy and Future. Stay tuned to this and future episodes at Strategy and Future. Thank you very much.
Thanks.